Today, we're going to begin Chapter 2. This is Part 1. This is Session 25. And this was supposed to happen last week, but obviously it didn't. So I was out of commission last week because of muscle inflammation. At any rate, these are the items we're going to try to go over today. We're going to do a little bit of an overview of Chapter 2. We're going to talk about the three big chunks of Bhagavad Gita, first 6 chapters, middle 6 chapters, and last 6 chapters. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about the flow of dialogue of Chapter 2. We're going to hear Arjuna's further doubts and finally Arjuna's surrender. So Chapter 2 is going to be kind of a difficult chapter because I call it a double wide, Chapter 2 and Chapter 18 both have almost twice as many verses in them as any of the other chapters, So Chapter 18 has, I think, 76 verses, and Chapter 2 has 72. So there's a lot of verses. So I can see us being here into July and August or something on Chapter 2, because a lot of stuff to cover. And I kind of apologize. These videos are a little information dense, so you might have to review various ones. And if things I say go over your head, you can't figure them out, don't worry about it. I'm kind of talking to a lot of different levels of people, people who are devotees for a long time, people who are new devotees, or not devotees at all. I'm also talking to people who may have a academic background or a scientific background. So there's a lot of different sort of dialogues going on here, and that's why there's a lot of different kinds of information. So if I'm talking to a particular group of people and you're not in that group, just don't worry about it, And there's a lot here. So I'm trying to pull together from, Prabhupada's own purports, from things Burijan has said, from things other people said, things I've realized myself, et cetera, et cetera. So, 5:10, sick day. Okay, so this is 5:17, what we just talked about, overview of Chapter 2, first third of Gita, flow of dialogue, Arjuna's further doubts. This is Session 25. Next week, we'll get into the segment that is kind of not the body segment, which goes from 2:10 to 2:30, but there's too many verses there. From 2:10 to 2:30 is 20 verses, so that's too many to take in one day. So I chopped it up into 3, and we'll go from verse 10 to 15 next week, and then we'll go from 16 to 21 the week after that, and then in June we'll go from 22 to 30. And the dates in June may get preempted because the Long Island trial is coming up, and I'm not sure whether I'll have much of a role in that as witness or whatever. So I may be gone, I may not be gone. Likely there won't be a preempt and I'll be here, but that's a possibility, so that could happen. On the 7th and the 14th, because those are through the dates that the trial is scheduled to be happening. All right, so on the 7th of June, we'll finish up the first section of Bhagavad Gita, and then we'll start with the next section, which is a smaller section, 31 to 38. That's a section in itself on June 14th. All right, so that's kind of how this may change, as I say. Yes.
Thank you again. Welcome back. So maybe I should wait till after it's done with Chapter 2, but I'm recalling that President Hansarupa once said in the Sunday morning Bhagavatam class that if one memorizes Chapter 2, they'll have successful preaching. Why do you think that, in a nutshell?
It's a summary. Both Chapter 2 and Chapter 18 are summary chapters. They say that if you're doing public speaking, when you explain things to people, first you should tell people what you're going to tell them, sort of a preview. Then you tell them, and at the end you tell them what you just told them. So you tell people what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. So Bhagavad Gita is set up exactly that way. So chapter 2 is Krishna ranges over the entire scope of Bhagavad Gita, but does it really in brief in chapter 2. And Arjuna doesn't get it. So then he goes through chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And in chapter 18, Krishna finally comes back and summarizes the whole thing again. So both those chapters are big because they're both summary chapters. So if you memorize chapter 2, it's got a lot of basic stuff in it. And that's one of the things that makes it a difficult chapter in one sense, because it's got so much packed into it. And some of the items that are packed into chapter 2, I don't get into in chapter 2 because I leave them for later chapters where there's more, it fits in better and there's more to say there, All right, so again, here we are. We're going to be doing texts 1 to 9. This is part 1 of chapter 2, and it's our 25th session if you're following on the internet. And again, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do an overview of chapter 2, the first third, the flow of dialogue, chapter 2, Arjuna's further doubts, and finally we'll end up with Arjuna's surrender. We'll see if we can get through with it. Okay, so this is the 3 big chunks of Bhagavad Gita. Can you read that? Is that illegible? And too low contrast? It's okay? Okay. Let me get another bottle of water I just tanked out here. So Bhagavad Gita is broken into 3 big sections, and they're each 6 chapters long. So the first 6 chapters, middle 6 chapters, and the final 6 chapters. So the first 6 chapters is mostly about different types of yoga or different practices in Vedic knowledge. And Krishna sort of runs through them as a kind of summary. So Krishna does that so that he and Arjuna are on the same page. Arjuna has grown up with the Bhagavad Gita and the teachings therein and Vedic knowledge. So Arjuna now understands, at least to some extent, various aspects of Vedic knowledge. So Krishna wants to touch on all of them. And then at the very end in chapter 6, Krishna will actually say what he really thinks he wants Arjuna to do. So he wants to be sure that when he's saying something, that Arjuna says, well, what about this? Or what about that? So they've already covered all that, by the time we get to chapter 6. And then by chapter 7, Krishna is ready to talk about Bhakti Yoga. And we've already talked about all the other stuff, so we're not thinking or talking about that anymore. So that's what happens in the middle 6 chapters. They're sometimes called the heart of the Gita. And, the last 6 chapters are kind of a review, but the last 6 chapters talk about how Jnana Yoga can be used in Bhakti Yoga. So sometimes we say the first 6 chapters are about Karma Yoga and how that can be used in Bhakti Yoga. The middle chapters are about Bhakti Yoga, and the last 6 chapters are about how Jnana Yoga can be used. So anyway, I'll go over some of the prominent ideas or prominent topics that exist in the first 6 chapters. There's the introduction, and in other words, we're being introduced to Bhagavad Gita. And then we did an introduction, Prabhupada does an introduction. And in this way, Krishna himself is doing an introduction by ramping his way through all these basic ideas in Bhagavad Gita, the basic, systems. India's Vedic knowledge is full of systems. There's the yoga system, there's the Sankhya system, there's the karma system, there's the, bhakti system. There are all these systems, and it depends on a person's advancement which system they're connected to. And these systems do interrelate. So that's why Krishna moves his way through the various systems. And, in chapter 2, we see that in chapter 2, we see Arjuna's perplexed. He's already perplexed in chapter 1, really. But at that point, Krishna begins to handle it. And so, as I said a couple of weeks ago, that what makes Arjuna every person is that Arjuna is in a crossroads in life. He's about to fight a battle. He's not sure whether he should be fighting the battle. Arjuna's fought battles, and battles don't scare him or bother him, but what bothers him about this battle is he's fighting his relatives. So that's why he's in a perplexed state of mind. And we all in the material world are in a perplexed state of mind. And of course, in the first 6 chapters, we hear about not being the body. We hear that Krishna does not emphasize his godhood. He speaks almost as if God is somebody else, In the middle 6 chapters, Krishna stops doing that. He directly comes out and confirms that he is God. But in the first 6 chapters, because he's talking kind of this sort of Vedic mystical stuff that is not dead-on bhakti. So, he is kind of a little bit indirect the way he explains himself. So that's going on in the first 6 chapters. That stops with the second 6 chapters. And then Krishna, as I said, gives an overview of Vedas, and finally he reveals his preferences in chapter 6. Yeah. Can you hold the mic for him? It's better if the person speaking doesn't hold the mic for themselves, because I always find that weird things happen when people do
Maharaj,
that.
my question is, my doubt is that you say that Krishna, from the second 6 chapters, he starts to reveal that he's God. Mm-hmm. Doesn't like talk like as though God's someone else. But my understanding is that he does that from the 4th chapter.
Well, to some extent he does. It depends on how clued in you are. But, if you notice the way the verses are written, that, Krishna says, surrender to him utterly, as if the Supreme, if you know Krishna is the Supreme, he's using the third person. And then that doesn't throw you off, because you understand he means, he's talking about the super soul, which is another manifestation of him. In one sense, it is him, but in another sense, we could see it as being separate from him. So it's that, 6 of one, half a dozen the other, which you run in all the time. That's the berserk thing about the Vedic knowledge, is because you can say something, you can say the opposite thing, and they're both true. Not in the same exact way, or else it would be meaningless, but it depends on your way of looking at it. And because Krishna is everything, especially when you're talking about Krishna, you can say something, you can say the opposite thing, and they're both true, which is surprising for people who don't know anything about the Vedas or never been connected with them, where we say things like, he is everywhere and yet he is nowhere. He is inside yet he's outside. He's the largest yet he's the smallest. He is very near yet he's very far away. So he walks but he does not walk. So this sounds like double talk to people who are not cued in to the nature of someone who is the grand superset of every other possible conceivable thing. So that's why you can say one thing about him and you can say the opposite thing, and they're both true, but they're not true in exactly the same way. So at any rate, I don't want to get in the whole side there, but so at any rate, we won't really talk we'll just brush these other two, because we're not in chapters 7 through 12 or chapters 13 through 18. So, of course, in the middle 6 chapters, we hear about Krishna revealing himself. We hear about knowledge relating to bhakti specifically. Before that, he's mentioning bhakti, but he's mentioning other stuff too. And at the 6th chapter, that's when Krishna actually reveals that bhakti is what he wants Arjuna to do. And then, he reveals his universal form in chapter 11. And then we hear in various parts about how, in chapter 12 particularly, the question of, is it better to worship the impersonal or the personal? And Krishna explains it in no uncertain terms in chapter 12. So now the last 6 chapters, we hear how jnana can be used in bhakti. We hear about the 3 modes, soul, nature, and supersoul. These are all important Vedic concepts that help us to understand how bhakti really works. We hear about this banyan tree, which is a metaphor for the material world. And finally, at the end of chapter 3, the section 3 is the 18th chapter, which is the summary where Krishna kind of goes back over talking about the modes, talking about various systems. He talks about renunciation. And finally, Arjuna accepts, and then the battle of Kurukshetra moves right on ahead after chapter 18 because the Bhagavad Gita is finished. All right, any questions about that? All right. So this is our chapter 2. This is the section that we're in right now, chapter 2. Arjuna has doubts. We've already heard most of them in chapter 1. So Krishna began to enumerate his various doubts, and now he finishes them up. And Krishna, in the very beginning, chides Arjuna. Then Arjuna reveals some more of his doubts. And then finally he surrenders to Krishna. So that's what happens in this first section. This is what we're going to do today, 1 through 9. Then section 2 of the second chapter is Krishna replies relating the body, soul, and reality. So we're going to hear about karma, about reincarnation, about the subtle body, about the gross body. And we're going to hear how the body is different from the soul, which is the kind of information that is completely missing in our modern way the world understands the reality around itself. So this goes on from 10 to 30. And as I said, this is too big a section, so I've broken it up into several pieces. And then Krishna's further arguments explaining the duty of a kshatriya, which is an unusual section. It goes from 31 to 38. So that's only 8 verses rather. So that's 8 verses. And Arjuna uses a kind of social argument there, which is odd, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Then there's what's called the Buddhi Yoga chapters. That goes from 39 to 53. And finally, the last from 54 to 72, Krishna answers Arjuna's 4 questions about what's the nature of a stita muni, or someone who is very fixed in consciousness. So Krishna uses that terminology, and Arjuna asks for symptoms and characteristics of this kind of stita muni, and that takes us from 54 to 72. So this is the entirety of chapter 2. This is just chapter 2. Buri John breaks it into these sections pretty much, and will be, as we progress through this month and into the next month and maybe the month after that, we'll go through all these and finish up chapter 2. If you have any questions, just shout them out. Now here's the dialogue. It's a little bit different. The other kind of talks about it from a philosophical, topical point of view, but this is the actual, how the dialogue moves. So Krishna chides Arjuna, which is what you'll see in the first verse of chapter 2. And then Arjuna explains further doubts. Then Arjuna surrenders but remains adamant about not fighting. And then Krishna explains the body, soul, spirit, matter, and reincarnation. So that's all happening in the second section. These first three happen in the first section. And then Krishna explains the duty of the Kshatriya, which happens in the third section. And then Krishna explains Buddhi Yoga, which is the fourth section. And then the fifth section is Arjuna asks 4 questions and Krishna answers them. So that's kind of how the flow of the dialogue moves. Yeah.
My question, Maharaj, is okay. The third point, the third bullet, there is Arjuna surrenders but remains adamant about not fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question naturally arises: how is Arjuna surrendering but remains? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you
So
explain
I think he does what most of us do. He surrenders, but he doesn't surrender. That's kind of that's what makes it really relatable, because he's saying, okay, whatever you say, but by the way, I'm not going to fight. Of course, we see at the very end of it, Arjuna is ready to fight. So we go from Bhagavad Gita verse, I think it's 7 or 8 in the second chapter, where he says, I shall not fight. And then we go all the way to chapter 18, where Krishna says, so Arjuna, have you heard me now? What would you do what you would like to do? And Arjuna said, yes, I've heard you, and I'm prepared to fight. So at that point, in all that time, all that dialogue that goes on between chapter 2 and chapter 18, by the very end of it, Arjuna has completely done 180, and he's ready to fight. So, at any rate, that's the flow of dialogue. If you're watching this on YouTube or something like that, you can always stop the frame and look at these. And eventually I'm going to put these slides up so that you can just see the slides by themselves outside of the context of the video. So, a lot of stuff that I plan to do that I haven't gotten around to. But I will. I promise.
My question, Maharaj, would be, why don't you have a camera here like that?
Because I've tried that before, and LCD screens blow out camcorders. They make all the colors go crazy because they're not a normal kind of light source.
Okay, right. So
And what I do is I take these and I actually put the slides. I put them in post, so they're there in the video itself. But I don't actually take a photograph while the lecture is going on. I just splice them in. All right, so we've talked about this before. These were Arjuna's reasons to withdraw. And we've talked about, this was all in chapter 1, this was my strange little acronym, CEDFI, CEDFI. So that's the first letter of each of these words. So compassion, Arjuna describes that objection to the battle in 127 and 137 and 38, 144 and 45. But he's also going to now explain compassion in 2.4 and 2.5. We're going to go over that in a minute. So that's also there. His objection to the battle, enjoyment, he can't enjoy with people he's killed. So that he talks about in 131 and 35 and 144. So that's not really here in this section. Then we have destruction of family, Bhagavad Gita 136 through 144. That's a whole section that he does in the first chapter. We talked about it in the previous chapter. We don't have any more of that in chapter 2. Fear of sinful reaction. This is 136, 144. And again, we're going to hear about it in 2.4 and 2.5. So both compassion and fear of sinful reaction are going to be in chapter 2. They're the two reasons for Arjuna to withdraw from the battle that flopped over into chapter 2. So indecision, this is the one that only is in chapter 2. It's 2.6. So we're going to see this in a minute. I'm just prefacing this because these are our various reasons why Arjuna opted or had the mindset that he wasn't going to fight. Now, here's our actual chapters, and I'll read them. Our actual verses, rather. Sanjaya said, seeing Arjuna full of compassion, his mind depressed, his eyes full of tears, Madhusudan Krishna spoke the following words. So, this is Sanjaya, as we said in chapter 1. Sanjaya is not on the battlefield. Actually, later on, Sanjaya will be a part of the battle because he's a soldier. But right now, at this point in time, he's in the palace at Hastinapur with Dhritarashtra, and through mystic vision, he's describing what's happening on the battlefield, which is miles away, and he's describing it to Dhritarashtra. So he's prefacing what Arjuna is planning to say, you know. So, this is, the word used here is Madhusudan. So that means that Krishna is, Madhu is a person, and Sudan is killer. Krishna killed Madhu. He was a demon. And so Arjuna is wanting Krishna to kill the demons of doubt. So this is what we get from the very first verse of chapter 2. Sanjaya said, seeing Arjuna full of compassion, his mind depressed, his eyes full of tears, Madhusudan Krishna spoke the following words. So in verse 2, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, my dear Arjuna, how have these impurities come upon you? They are not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to higher planets, but to infamy. So this is, in this section that we're reading, 1 through 9, this is the only place Krishna speaks. But in the rest of the Bhagavad Gita, it'll be mostly Krishna speaking, with only a few interjections here and there from Arjuna. But here, in this section, mostly it's Arjuna speaking. So this is the one place where Krishna himself speaks. And Arjuna is given these objections to the battle of Kurukshetra, and Krishna doesn't accept them. And rather, he characterizes these objections not as compassionate and well thought out philosophical important items to consider. He calls them impurities. So Krishna has a completely different outlook on it. And he is objecting to Arjuna. He's saying they're not befitting a man who knows the higher values of life. They lead not to higher planets, but to infamy. So he's cautioning Arjuna about these ways of thinking that Arjuna has just spoken in chapter 1, and now he's going to complete speaking them in chapter 2. So what's interesting here, I'm going to kind of fold in a few of Prabhupada's special, purports that he makes in the purports here. He describes the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the purport as in 3 features. We're going to talk about this more later on in Bhagavad Gita, but here I'll just touch on it. He quotes this verse from the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Vedanti tat tattva vidas, Vedanti tat tattva vidas, touch gyanam. I can't remember the whole verse now, but Brahmeti Paramatmeti Bhagavan iti Shabdyate. So what the verse says is that those who are sages describe this non-dual substance in 3 features as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So God or Krishna has 3 features. He has the Brahman, the all-pervading essence feature. He has the Paramatma, which is the super soul within the heart, and he has the Bhagavan feature, which is the personal feature. So here, Arjuna is dealing with God through the Bhagavan or personal feature. And later on we're going to describe and understand that the Paramatma feature is for the yogis. The yogis meditate on the Paramatma in the heart chakra, whereas the Brahman feature is for the Jnanis. The Jnanis try to understand the all-pervading feature of the Supreme. But the Bhaktas, the devotees, they're not interested in either of those two features. They're focusing only on the Bhagavan, or the personal feature of the Lord. So that's there. And what else did Prabhupada say in the purports here? He also talks about God's 6 opulences, that Parasara Muni has described that the Supreme can be characterized by 6 excellences. He has all wealth, all fame, all knowledge, all beauty, all strength, and all renunciation. So we'll hit that again, but these are characteristics that no other person can lay claim to. There are people who are beautiful, there are people who are wealthy, there are people who are strong, there are people who are renounced, but no one is the extreme of all those things at the same time, only God. So that's the verse given by Parasara Muni. So now we'll go to verse 3 here. O Pritha, do not yield to this degrading impotence. It does not become you. Give up such petty weakness of heart and arise, O chastiser of the enemy. So these two actually are Krishna speaking. He's addressing Arjuna as son of Pritha, meaning that Arjuna and Krishna are actually relatives. So, and that this is a indication that he's from a royal family, and that he not only has to think about his own reputation, but he's soiling the reputation of the entire dynasty. So he basically is asking Arjuna to give up this hesitation to fight. He's not giving him any reasons why, but he's just asking him to give it up. But then Arjuna interjects here, O killer of enemies, O killer of Madhu, how can I counterattack with arrows in battle men like Bhishma and Drona who are worthy of my worship? Now this C and F, they go back to the previous thing here. C is for compassion, F is for sinful, fear of sinful reaction. So 2-4, 2-4. So that's what the C and F. So here, how can I counterattack men like Bhishma and Drona? So here, Arjuna is giving a compassionate reason, and he's giving a fear of sinful reaction reason. So he's making that point. And Bhishma Dev and Drona are both teachers and senior to Arjuna. It's one thing when you're fighting some nameless enemy on a battlefield. It's another thing when you're fighting your own teachers and people who raised you. So he thinks if he kills Bhishma and Drona, certainly because they're authorities, they should not even be given a verbal, rebuke. What to speak of literally firing arrows and trying to kill them, So this would certainly be sinful. So this is Arjuna's way of thinking here. And it would be better to live in this world by begging than to live at the cost of lives of great souls who are my teachers. Even though desiring worldly gain, they are superiors. If they are killed, everything we enjoy will be tainted with blood. So again, compassion and fear of sinful reaction. That's the two items that Arjuna is worried about there. And nor do we know which is better, conquering them or being conquered by them. If we killed the sons of Dhritarashtra, we should not care to live. Yet they are now standing before us on this battlefield. So here is where indecision, we find that item entering for the first time in Arjuna's litany of various reasons to forego the battle. We do not know which is better, conquering them or being conquered by them. So he's suggesting that the moral rectitude of fighting this battle is questionable. Should he fight it or should he not? And he's not clear that it's the correct thing to be fighting this battle. So this is why he's feeling that everything could be tainted with blood. And he's suggesting it would be better to live by begging, because as a Kshatriya, that's what Kshatriyas do, they rule. And throughout this whole section, Prabhupada is explaining a lot about Kshatriya nature. You know, Kshatriyas are rulers. We have the Varnashram system, we have those who are Brahmanas, and their duty in life is to teach and to learn and to be of assistance in that way to the whole of society. And there are those who are Kshatriyas whose duty is to rule, to organize society and keep destabilizing influences from vitiating society. That's what Kshatriyas do. So they're not supposed to beg, whereas Brahmanas usually do beg. That's how they make their living. You know, people give them donations, etc. That's how Brahmanas live. But Kshatriyas, they work by ruling, and they get taxes, and that's how Kshatriyas stay alive. And then you have Vaishyas who are in business, and they supply the needs of everybody in society, and they make their money through profit. And then you have finally Shudras who are supported mostly by the Vaishyas, and in that way they get what they need. So this is, by the way, just a side note here, this is not the same as the modern Indian caste system, which is a completely, wrongly implemented understanding of these four varnas. You know, the varnas are actually there not because of someone's birth, but they're there by someone's quality of work. But in modern India, the caste system is there only by birth. So if a person has been born a Brahmin, even if they're disqualified, they're seen and respected as a Brahmin, even though they have no ability to do any of the items that are required of a Brahmin. Similarly, if someone is actually showing or displaying Brahminical qualities but doesn't happen to be born in a family of Brahmanas, they are not accepted. So this is why the caste system is a travesty on the actual original thing, and why all the sages of India and even the recent devotees that are part of our disciplic session have always spoken against the caste system. But there is a true system that is based on these varnas: Brahmana, Vaishya, Kshatriya, and Sudra. Anyway, I'll move on here. Now I'm confused about my duty and have lost all composure because of miserly weakness. In this condition, I'm asking you to tell me for certain what is best for me. Now I am your disciple and a soul surrendered unto you. Please instruct me. So in verse 7 here, this is where Arjuna has thought about it. He's heard what Krishna has just said. And he's deciding that at this point in time, it's not clear to me I'm doing the right thing. It's not clear to me I'm doing the wrong thing. And I don't know what to do. But I trust you, Krishna. So in this verse, Arjuna is moving from being a friend to Krishna to being a disciple of Krishna. And that's a substantial change. Of course, from a lot larger perspective. Later on, Arjuna goes back to being a friend of Krishna. But the two are kind of incompatible because being a friend and being a disciple are not the same thing. The position of being a disciple means you accept what the guru or spiritual master says, and you do so even if you might think otherwise. But you're asking for the advice in a way that it's not like once you ask for the advice, you say, well, it's good, I'll think about it. You're asking for the advice, and you're going to implement the advice in your life. So there's a whole thing we could say about the nature of the guru and disciple relationship. We'll do that more thoroughly in chapter 4, where it fits more squarely. But we'll just say a few things about it here, and that one doesn't take a guru just because you have some mystical experience or you have some affinity for the way somebody talks or whatever it is. But accepting a guru is a serious matter, like getting married, and it means that you have actually investigated the person, and you see that they are speaking not off the top of their head, off their own mental guessing, but they are speaking from the Vedic literature, but they're able to, in a 3D or 4D way, be able to show how the Vedas say what they say, how it's cohesive. So if a person can't do that, they're not guru. If a person says one thing and does another thing, they're not guru. If a person doesn't have any idea what they say, they're just making up things as they go along, they're not a guru. If a person may have had some mystical experience or dream or have some mystic powers, that doesn't make them a guru. So this is where Arjuna changes. And from this point forward, Krishna is going to be speaking to Arjuna not as a friend, but as Arjuna's guru. So Arjuna will now add some of his emotional feelings here. I can find no means to drive away this grief which is drying up my senses. I will not be able to dispel it, even if I win a prosperous, unrivaled kingdom on earth with sovereignty like that of the demigods in heaven. So this is the emotional side of what Arjuna is going through. And then finally, Arjuna ends it off with Sanjaya explaining, this is what Arjuna said. Having spoken thus, Arjuna, chastiser of the enemies, told Krishna, Govinda, I shall not fight, and fell silent. So as we were saying a minute ago, he's just surrendered, but then, okay, I'll surrender, but I'm not going to fight. Okay? That's not the way it works, but this is what Arjuna says. And this is kind of the way that we do it. So Arjuna is in a situation like many people are, where Prabhupada talks about the perplexity of the material world. He uses that word, perplexity. Arjuna is in perplexity. We are in perplexity. Material nature puts people into perplexity because people who don't know what they're doing in life will naturally break the laws of karma and will not be reciprocating with the Supreme Lord because they don't even know what that is or why to do it. So little by little, karma and the reactions of all the things you are not doing right will back you off into a corner, somewhere, someplace, sometime. And you will feel the whole world is against you. And you'll feel there's something devastatingly wrong. And you won't know exactly why. But if you come in contact with spiritual life, in contact with the message of Bhagavad Gita, that can all change. And you can understand that the one thing that fixes everything is to understand there is a God and to try to reciprocate with God through service and eventually through love. So if we're not willing to do that, nothing will work out in the long run. Everything will just grind and bump, until we come to the fag end of life and, our body's not working anymore. And everything seems to be against us. Any questions about that? Oh, that's our... Yeah.
Maybe it's better to ask a Prasad, but when you mention how the caste system present day is not like the Vedic, was that an overnight a significant thing that changed it to how it is, or is that like that's probably a whole thing in itself?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, over many, even hundreds of years, the caste system gradually disintegrated and degenerated into what it is today in India. And the great sages are not talking about that system. They're talking rather about the original system that Krishna instituted. The caste system exists, or we could say the varnashram system. I'll use varnashram system when I mean the legitimate version, and I'll use the caste system when I mean the asuric or the wrongly implemented version. So the varnashram system, Krishna explains, and he'll talk about it in Bhagavad Gita. He describes, what the characteristics of Brahmanas are, of Kshatriyas, of Vaishnavas, and Sudras. And he says that they're guna karma vibhagasha, that the Varnas are based on guna karma vibhagasha is in various categories. So they are delineated not with janma, which is birth, but with guna and karma. Guna is is qualities, and karma is work. So what varna a person's in is not based on their birth, but it's based on their guna, their qualities or qualifications, and their karma, the work that they naturally fall into. And we see that even if nobody talks about varnas or about any of this stuff, there are still people who are going to be teachers. There are still people who are going to be administrators and government officials and police and soldiers. There's still people who are going to be businessmen and agriculturalists. There's still going to be people who just fit in all kinds of miscellaneous categories. That's going to happen. But what makes the varnashram system different than that is that when it's properly done, these four work together in a harmonious way rather than having what we lovingly call class conflict. That's what we have in our modern world, where these classes are not harmonious with one another. They're vying for control. And so we have modern political systems that either put one of these other classes at the head rather than the way that the varnashram system is supposed to work. Okay, so the key thing here is this verse, Karpana doshopahata svabhava prachchami tvam dharma samudra cheta yatstrayasyan mishchitam bruhi tanme shishyasteham sadi mam tvam prapana. Now I'm confused about my duty and I have lost all composure because of miserly weakness. In this condition, I'm asking you to tell me for certain what is best for me. Now I'm your disciple and a soul surrender unto you. Please instruct me. So this is the key change here that has come over Arjuna. And this is why the mood of Bhagavad Gita changes at this point. Till this point, Arjuna and Krishna have been discussing as if they were friends on an equal level. So after Arjuna surrenders, then they're talking as if they are disciple and guru. And Arjuna is submissively hearing what Krishna is going to say. And he asks questions, so he understands it, but he won't challenge it, just like in the school generally. When you go to school, you pay your money, and you assume the professor knows what they're talking about, and you accept his information. But just like we were talking about with the caste system not being based on birth, the guru also is not based on what class or what varna he comes from. Usually, the idea is in the Vedic system, the guru comes from the class known as Brahmanas. Those are the teachers, the natural leaders. But Prabhupada in the purports shows us with various verses that if the guru actually understands the process of spiritual life and can show one Krishna, even if they come from a class of dog eaters, which is not even in the varnashram system. So we have, the Brahmanas, which are considered the head, the Kshatriyas, which are next down, the Vaishyas, which are next down from there, and finally the Sudras. The dog eaters are not even in that. They're called Anchajas. They're fifth class. They don't even fit into that. But if someone who understands spiritual life comes out of even a class of people like that, even they should be considered guru. However, if a Brahmana who has all the Vedic knowledge but doesn't understand how to serve the Supreme Lord, such a person should not be accepted as guru. So it's not about birth, it's not about caste or class, it's about knowledge, and the same way with guru. So good, so we are right about at the time we should be. Any final questions before I go back over what we're going to talk about next week? Well, you could think if anything comes to your mind here. Again, this is what we showed in the very beginning. Today was 5:17. Next week is 5:24. We're going to start off with now from 10 to 15. Krishna's going to go onto the pulpit, and he's going to be speaking, and mostly Arjuna will be listening. And Arjuna will ask some questions like he does, in the last section, 53 or somewhere like that, when we start the section where we're talking about Arjuna's 4 questions. So sometimes Arjuna will ask a question and Krishna will answer it. But mostly Krishna will be speaking from this point onward in Bhagavad Gita. So Krishna is going to explain why what Arjuna is thinking is a mistake. And we're going to hear about the chariot of the body, we're going to hear about the nature of the soul, about happiness or distress. And the week following that, we're going to hear more about reincarnation, the nature of the soul, the reasons for fighting as opposed to Arjuna's reasons not to fight. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Sankhya. We haven't mentioned Sankhya yet. Just yesterday, our, what is his name, Chaitanya Charan or something, gave a class, and he kind of explained Sankhya a little bit. Sankhya is kind of a very involved system, and we will be referring to it a lot because sometimes chapter 2, verse 10 through 30 are considered the Sankhya Yoga system chapter verses, because Sankhya is kind of the Vedic explanation of how reality works. There's 24 elements, 5 knowledge-acquiring senses, 5 working senses, 5 gross material elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and 5 tanmatra, or subtle sense objects, which are sound, form, taste, touch, and smell. And then we have, that's 20, so 4 groups of 5 is 20. And then you have, beyond that, mind, intelligence, and false ego, that's 23 now. And then the last one is sometimes called soul or time. And then, as Chaitanya Charan was saying the other day, we also talk about the supreme soul, about God. So at least the theistic versions of Sankhya. There is a atheistic version of Sankhya, which is what most people hear. And in academia, Nobody really studies anything but the atheistic version of Sankhya, which was explained by an atheist named Kapila. But there's the original Sankhya, which was explained by the original Kapila, which we're actually reading about at this very moment in Srimad Bhagavatam in 3rd canto, in the 20s chapters, you know. So that's where we hear about the real Kapila, who originally taught Samkhya. But much, much later than this is the modern atheist Kapila, who also taught us Sankhya, which is an atheistic philosophy, which doesn't refer to God at all. So we'll kind of touch that a little bit. All right, so this is kind of my basic idea of what's going to be happening in the future. So any final comments or questions? If so, if not, then thank you all. You have a question? Thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavad Gita, all glories to Vaishnava devotees, the Lord. Hare Krishna.